Okay, so back in session 7, we built a simple application with some user notification. We covered those things. So now we want to talk about what you're going to do in a real application and how you're going to add more fields to it and how you're going to organize those fields, because a two-column layout like this obviously is not going to work for most applications. So what I've done here is I took my name, I broke it into two new fields. So I've got first name and last name. I still have the same email address. I still have my same button. And then I've added information for an address. So I've got street, city, state, and zip. So I want to show you today how you can organize all these components of your application with Freeform. Now, Freeform is Freeform, so you can certainly organize it any way you see fit. But the way I typically build applications, I've got sort of a general pattern that I use, and you can basically leverage the layout mechanisms that are used for laying out content on your pages to organize your Freeform application. So what I like to do is I always start my Freeform application by assuming I'm going to be running a one-column layout at the top. So instead of running two columns, I'm going to convert it to a one-column layout. And if you're running Foundation 5, you'd be running a 24-column layout. If you're running Foundation 6, you'd be running a 12-column layout like this. But I'm going to leave this as 24 for the time being. And again, the 100% is basically saying if I have labels, I want to put them on top. If I have complex components that have two parts, put one part on top of the other. So I'm going to save that. Okay, and if I go back here and I refresh this, it's going to do pretty much what I would expect. I'm going to convert this to a one-column layout. Now, still doesn't quite look the way I want. What I want is my first name to be next to my last name, my email to take up an entire line. I want my button to be somewhere down at the bottom, and I want my address components organized together. So what I do is I start by taking all my form fields, and I like to organize them into a grid. So I'm going to take my first name, my last name, my email, street, city, state, and zip, and I'm going to move them all into a grid element. Because a grid element is a layout component, I can move them all in there. And now I'm going to take that grid and I'm going to actually call it something. It's the last thing here. Hang on a second. I'm going to call it form fields. All right, and you'll see right now, as we move to Foundation 6, the default grid layout is set to 12, but if you're running Foundation 5, you'll just change that back to 24. All right, and I'm going to set my labels on top. And now if I set it back to 12, I'll have exactly what I had before, but I'm going to leave this as 24 for the time being so I can show you how to do some further organization with your form fields. Now the second thing I'm going to do while I'm here is I'm going to take this button and I'm going to move it into a grid as well, because eventually I'm going to have an application that's probably going to have multiple buttons, and I want to control the layout of those, and I typically put those at the bottom of my form fields. So I'll do the same thing here. Buttons don't have labels on top, so I'm just going to set it to 24. And for that button, I want to take up 1/3 of the screen, so I'm going to set it to 8. So I'm going to save this, I'll return, and when I refresh, you'll see my button's going to be at the bottom. It's taken up 1/3 of the screen here, and actually, yeah, that's about right. And I've still got these form fields, but they're not quite organized the way I want them. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to do further organization. So you can see my dashboard is shaping up. I've got it well organized. I've got form fields on top. I've got my buttons down below. I've got all these components inside. So what I can do now is I'm going to go and organize these things a bit. So I know I want my last name next to my first name, my email next, and I want street, city, state, and zip. This is laid out in a one-column layout, so things like my email and my street are probably okay, but I probably want to group these three things and the first and last name. So all I'm going to do is do just what I did before. I'm going to take these two components, I'm going to move them into another grid, so I'll have a grid within a grid. I'm going to move that to the top. I'm going to edit that. I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to say this is my name, and I know it's got my first and last name. For Foundation 5, I'm going to say it's a 24-column grid, and each thing is going to take up 12. All right. Then I'm going to return, and I'm going to say email and street are fine, but I'm going to take these three components, and I'm going to move them into a grid. So now this grid is going to be my city, state, and zip. City, state, and zip. This is just documentation here, and I'm going to have 24%, so I want my labels on top. And now I'm going to say my city is going to take up 12, and I'm going to say my State is going to take up 4, and my zip is going to take up 8, right? So the state's a very small field because there's a drop down, and the zip code will be a little bit bigger. So let's just see what I get there. So I'm going to save that and refresh. And now I've got first name, last name, email, street, city, state, and zip. So I can fill out my form just like before. I can't quite type my email address. Saucier, Minnesota 55334, and submit. All right, so there you go for organizing form fields, simple and easy.